Yeah.
Done.
Does everyone see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So,
There we go.
all right. So just to review our protocol, I want to begin promptly. So we'll have your microphones muted during the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. And if you guys would use the chat box to post questions by writing them out to everyone, we'll use those to keep track of questions. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce our speaker. The CAT team is really happy to present Dr. Leon Clarke, who's an expert in energy and environmental issues, and with a focus on climate change mitigation strategies, energy technology options, and modeling. He's currently the research director at the Center for Global Sustainability and a research professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Dr. Clarke has served as an author and coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, the National Climate Assessment, and National Research Council. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Clarke, and thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. You forgot to mention that I'm the son of Bob and Rosalie Clarke, which is my biggest claim to fame. I just want to
I was going to wait for that at the end to embarrass them. But no, thank you. I want to thank them for introducing you to us and giving us the avenue to have you as our presenter. So thank you, Rosalie and Bob. Without you,
that's
really
what I'm
possible.
most proud of everything that's been mentioned. So, okay, so let me move to see me share my screen. Let's see if I can get this to work. So let's see. Okay, great. Is it showing my the big screen?
It is.
Okay, good. And if there's any trouble with my mic, let me know, because I gave a talk the other day and it was coming in and out, so I'll have to go in and out of Bluetooth if it's causing trouble. Okay, good. So hopefully this will be of interest to you guys. I'm just kind of guessing the correct set of topics to go through, but if it's not exactly right, we can do it another time too if there's interest. So I guess the big question here is where are we and where are we headed in the United States with respect to climate change, and to some degree, what can we do? So I guess this is the climate action. What's the name of this group?
Climate Action Team of the UUFM.
Right. Great. So you guys are on the ball. So I guess I don't need to tell you that climate change is an important issue. I probably don't need to tell you that climate change, greenhouse gases are primarily from fossil fuels, though not all, of course. They come from a range of sources, and they're not all CO2 from fossil fuels, but mostly fossil fuels. Burning fossil fuels is a cause of climate change. Let's just review the basic elements of this before we get started. I think you probably all realize that climate change is very difficult and challenging to handle because it has a number of vested interests, but it's also what the economists call a public goods problem, which means that the effects of whatever your actions are very dispersed. They don't come right back to you. So you don't always have an incentive to do anything about it. You only have an incentive really to do something about it because you're trying to do something for the common good. So the questions I want to address for this conversation, and I guess we're gonna have a conversation afterwards, so that'll be good. So I'm just gonna put some stuff on the table and then we'll talk. The questions for this talk are sort of where is the world headed, and what's going on in the US right now, and what does that mean for the future, both for the US and for the rest of the world, and to some extent, what can we be doing to address the issue? Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background on international climate policy, which you may also be familiar with. But if you went back to the late 90s, there was an agreement called the Kyoto Protocol. And that was an agreement whereby countries around the world agreed to reduce their emissions. And they agreed, but they didn't really reduce them according to what they agreed to. And there were a couple of issues with the Kyoto Protocol. So this was done through the UN. But one of the big issues with the Kyoto Protocol was that it set binding targets for countries. So they were signing on to binding targets that they had to meet through some international agreement. I can't remember exactly what those numbers were, but basically the rich countries needed to reduce their emissions and then potentially pay for emissions reductions in the poor countries. That's roughly a way to put it. And it was what you would call a top-down method. So you have this big agreement, tells everybody what to do. Well, it didn't really work that well. We kind of backed out in the US. And the community was searching for many, many years for an alternative of what to do. And a lot of the thinking back then was, hey, we'll pick a global target. We're going to reduce emissions by 20%, and then we're going to divvy it up and decide who's going to do what. And so you're starting from the top. Here's a goal. Now we'll divvy up that goal. So that didn't really work. So in 2015, countries around the world signed the Paris Agreement. And that was a new international agreement on climate mitigation, but it took a completely different approach. Instead of saying, here's how much we're going to do and let's divvy it up, instead said, hey, let's pick a goal. Our goal is to limit temperature change to 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And I can certainly talk about that if that's of interest. But instead of mandating every country or any country do anything, we're going to leave it up to you guys. So countries can propose what are called nationally determined contributions. And that just means that every country is on its own to figure out what it's going to do. And that sounds like maybe it's not going to work, because why would any country do anything if you're not forced to? But there's a lot of pressure. So there's a lot of international pressure. It gets into sort of geopolitics. The US actually came out with an agreement with China to push on this, I guess, maybe actually before it was signed, actually. They came out with an agreement with China to make progress on this. And so it put a lot of international pressure. And in fact, you got a bunch of countries putting together their nationally determined contributions. And in the US, what we committed to was to reduce emissions by 24 to 26%. And I believe it's below 2010 levels, although I have to go back and look again. But 24 to 26%, just remember that, by 2025. So in 5 years. 5 years from now, at the time, roughly 10 years. So the US agreed to make those reductions, and that was with the last administration. Let me see if there's anything else I want to say here. Okay, no, that's it. And we'll come back to this in just a moment. So then the question is, what does that actually mean? Stepping back, the goal is to limit temperature change to well below 2 degrees or to 1.5 degrees globally. What does that mean? Okay, so I'm going to show a complicated slide. I mean, it's not that complicated, but a slide that I'm used to seeing over and over and over and over again. So I don't even have to look at it in any way to know what's going on. But for those who haven't seen it, let me just explain what it is. So this is a slide, this is a figure. It's a very, very important figure, actually. It's a very important figure in international climate negotiations. And it's from a report called the 1.5 degree report put out by the IPCC. And what it's showing is a whole bunch of different scenarios trying to limit temperature change to 2 degrees or to 1.5 degrees, okay? And I will highlight a couple of elements of this chart. So first off, just to explain what it is, on the vertical axis, it's showing emissions. And then on the horizontal axis is time. So it's showing how emissions need to change over time. And the blue lines and the blue shaded region are scenarios that limit temperature change to 1.5 degrees. And the gray are scenarios that limit, actually, that's not true. The gray are also those, but those have higher what's called overshoot. So both of these sets of lines are scenarios limiting temperature change to 1.5 degrees, okay? So a couple of key points about this. One is that in most scenarios that don't, quote, overshoot, and I'll explain what that means, we need to get CO2 emissions down to zero by around mid-century. That's 30 years from now. So they need to be zero by 2050, roughly. Now, different scenarios give different results, but that is the basic guidelines that came out of the IPCC. So that's the first point I'll make. A second point is there are scenarios, and I've produced scenarios like this, that allow us to do it later, but by the way they do it is by second half of the century, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and pumping it underground into deep saline reservoirs. And that's technologically quite viable, actually, but politically, it's not clear to me there's a lot of interest in doing that. So, and those scenarios overshoot the temperature. They go well above 1.5, and then they come back down. But the thing that's most important to remember is this 2050 goal, because that's becoming an accepted goal internationally. Let's get emissions down to zero by 2050 if we want to limit it to 1.5 degrees. And in fact, China just came out, I don't know if you guys saw this, but China just came out with an announcement that they're going to limit, they're going to reach carbon neutrality, get CO2 emissions to zero by 2060, which is actually within the range for a developing or emerging economy in terms of the timing. So they're actually, to the extent that they actually do it, that would be consistent with these goals. The other thing that I want to just point out, in this, you will often hear in this business what it means, what you need to do to get to 1.5 degrees. That's not actually what it means. What it means is, what do you need to do to have a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of temperature increase? It's not actually limiting to 1.5. It could be limited to less. It could be a lot more. There's so much uncertainty in our understanding of the climate that actually we can only do it probabilistically. And then there's all sorts of questions about that. And the 2-degree numbers, which are around 2070 to 2080, those are for a, quote, likely chance of limiting temperature change to 2 degrees, which is 70%. So just remember, when we talk about 1.5, we're not guaranteeing limiting temperature change or limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. We're giving ourselves a 50-50 chance, or maybe slightly better. Okay, so that's kind of what it means in a general sense. So then you ask, what does it mean for the US? And this is the second figure that I will show, and I think the only other one that there will be 3 of these figures that have almost exactly the same character. And the character is, on the left side, they show what's been happening historically in terms of emissions. And then they'll have a steep line going down, like the last figure. And then they'll show where things might be in the future. So responding to all of this, the US in 2016 put together what's called its mid-century strategy, a plan to reduce emissions. And this was from the last administration, which was a little bit more interested in climate than the current administration. And that administration was looking at what it would mean to get down to 80% reduction. So not all the way to 100, but that wasn't in vogue at that time. So 80% reductions by 2050 were in vogue. And this is showing 3 different strategies for doing it. And I think, again, one important thing to note is just that the numbers here on the left, emissions, are a lot bigger than the numbers here on the right. And that's over 30 years. So 3 decades, we have to make substantial changes. And that's really important. And for those folks like myself who do this a lot, it's kind of a depressing business sometimes, being in climate change mitigation. But there's potentially some good news going on. We'll see. A couple of other points to make. Just to note that emissions of greenhouse gases are not just CO2 from fossil fuels. That's in blue. Non-CO2 gases like methane, which can come from fugitive emissions from piping gas around, or from agriculture, nitrous oxide, which comes from using fertilizers. So these sorts of gases are also part of the issue, and they're extremely hard to get rid of. They go away in the atmosphere quickly, but they're hard to reduce. And then finally, the US, in all of its efforts in international dimensions, always uses what's called a land use sink. forests and land in the US are sucking up CO2. And so the US hopes that that will continue in the future. And so it doesn't have to reduce as much emissions from fossil fuels. Because if we can continue, if we can hit 2050 and get to zero while still using fossil fuels to some extent, if we know that our forests and other parts of our country are growing. And that's just part of the US developing and now reforesting, basically. For example, in the Northeast, there's a lot of reforesting from what used to be farms. So this is what came out of the mid-century strategy, and we actually helped put together a lot of this where I work. And the U.S. put together a strategy to try and reduce emissions. Now, let me see. There was one other thing I wanted to mention. I guess one thing I would mention then here is also that the U.S. Now has a different administration. And the U.S. no longer is committed to the Paris Agreement, although I don't think we've formally pulled out yet, but we are no longer interested, let's say, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So this was from the last administration. It's not, this mid-century strategy is not as important to the new administration. Okay, then one more, a slide just to say a little bit. I want to say, what does it mean to reduce emissions? And this gets a little bit to what we can all do as individuals. So there's really 3 ways we deal with fossil emissions. One of them is we use less energy. If we can use less energy, then that means we're burning less fossil fuels. It's as simple as that. It's really quite straightforward. The problem, of course, is that we have nice big homes compared to most people in the world. We have very large homes compared to most people in the world. We drive around, we fly around, and all of these things use energy. So energy efficiency is not going to solve everything. And frankly, if you look around the world, most folks don't use even close to as much energy as we do, are much less rich, and as they become richer, it seems quite natural that they'll want to use more. So energy efficiency is not the only option, but it's a very important option. A second is then reducing the emissions from electricity, and I'm sure you've all know about photovoltaic cells and so forth, but there's a lot of opportunities to reduce emissions from electricity. That is broadly considered one of the most important approaches to reducing emissions over the near term. And so that means basically using solar photovoltaics. It means using hydropower, wind power. There's big debates in the environmental community about nuclear power, which has traditionally been has not been approved by the environmental community and the climate community. It's a little bit back and forth, actually, because got to do something, and so on and so forth. And then finally is end use switching to electricity. So the idea is you make electricity clean, and then you use your electric car. And you don't use, as much as I love, as my mom knows, I love to cook with gas. Gas is the best way in my mind to cook. But in the long run, we really shouldn't be cooking with gas. We should be cooking with electricity. And we have gas furnaces. We shouldn't be using gas furnaces. We need to be using electric heat pumps. Basically, what we need to do is move as many of these uses right now that are on fossil fuels. We need to move them over to electricity. That's basically that's essential. And some people will say, well, hey, if we change my electric car, I change to an electric car, well, we're still using a lot of coal, so I'm just now burning coal instead of gas. We're still using coal to do electricity. That's true, but in the long run, that won't be true. So a core strategy is to move over. And these are, if you look at literature on this, they're phrased different ways in different studies, but these are always the same. Reduce energy, decarbonize the electricity sector, and switch to electricity and alternative fuels. Things like hydrogen are a little bit farther down the line. Mostly for now, it's electricity. And that's kind of this is kind of where it is. So what does that mean in terms of what we have to do? Here's a couple of notes just from literature, so from works that a colleague of mine did. So this would mean that all home heaters are electric by 2030. So we're not using furnaces, we're using heat pumps, or all new sales of heaters. All space heating is 100% electric by almost mid-century. 90% of all passenger miles are from electricity or electric fuels, electricity-derived fuels by mid-century. So it's pretty dramatic changes that need to happen, and happen relatively rapidly across the entire country. Okay, so, oh, actually, before I go to this, then I'm going to say, one thing I wanted to also mention, just that's in these transitions, a lot of this stuff is about, hey, what do we need to do? What's the way you do it? It's kind of an engineering perspective. This is what we need to do to reduce emissions. But we also have to remember that it has a huge societal implication. So the fact of the matter is there's a lot of folks who have jobs in coal. Well, not many anymore, actually. A lot of it's now mechanized. But a lot of folks sort of have either an emotional attachment or have jobs that are associated with fossil fuels. I mean, fracking is huge in the US. The US is a big fossil producer now. It was in the past and is again now. And there's a lot of jobs there. And frankly, I think it's really important in this domain not to blame folks who feel as if they are threatened by this change, because those are very legitimate concerns. And I remember being in meetings for, international meetings in the UN, and the Saudi Arabians are often quite concerned, and to some extent that's there's this notion, well, they're holding up progress. Well, the fact is their entire economy is built on fossil fuels, and without some way to address that and think about this in terms of fairness, it's a big issue. And this is happening everywhere. China has an enormous number of coal jobs. I mean, just enormous. It's core to their economy. What do you do? Certain provinces in China, their economies are built on coal. What's the strategy? How do you handle that? Germany has that in Eastern Germany, and what they've done, since they're very rich, is pour money into it. But not everybody can do that. But I just want to point out that folks in those industries have built careers and have their livelihoods based on it. And so if we don't acknowledge that and think about that and think about what's called just transitions, it's going to be very hard to move. So there's winners and losers, and we have to be very aware of that. Okay, so I think we all know that as of 2016, we got a new administration, and the new administration had a different perspective on climate mitigation than the past administration. This current administration we have now is not as devoted to climate mitigation as the last administration. And so that's raised a lot of concern from folks in the US climate community about what that means. Are we actually going to be able to do anything? Are we now not going to be able to move on climate? And and we're planning to pull out to Paris, as I mentioned. We've tried to roll back actions to some degree, and in generally just haven't supported climate mitigation. So the question then is, what's the implication of that? Is nothing happening then? Is it all over for the US? And the answer is actually not at all. And I'll come back to this, but it's kind of fascinating. It's almost as if the change in the administration was good for climate mitigation in the US, because what it's done is it's pushed entities all around the US to take action by themselves, to take it upon themselves to devote their energies to climate mitigation. And as you know, the US is a federal system, so states actually have a decent amount of power. And so they can take action. And so we've been doing work through what's called America's Pledge, which is or in my job. I'm not doing my job today. This is me as a person. I'm not representing anybody, just to be clear. But in my professional career, I do work. We've been doing work with what's called America's Pledge, and that was set up by Jerry Brown and Michael Bloomberg, and to explore what subnational actors could do: cities, states, businesses, faith-based groups, and so forth. And what you can see here, this is showing the level of action in 2019. These are a whole bunch of different actors who are committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And this includes a bunch of states, which I'll mention in just a sec, tribes, and so forth. And you can see it's an enormous number of folks who have committed, or entities. So there's just been this groundswell of action from the bottom in the US, largely in response to the change in the administration, frankly. I mean, there was still action, like California is super aggressive, but there was still action, but the action has changed. And in fact, let me talk a little bit about which states are invested in this. So this is a picture of what's called the United States Climate Alliance, and it's a set of governors who have committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think it's fascinating, because if you look at it, you get the usual suspects: California, Oregon, Washington, although Oregon and Washington, I might just add, have very big east-west splits. in their perspectives on these kinds of issues. But nonetheless, as does California, from the valley to the coasts. But you see that, and then you see the Northeast, it's just what you expect: Massachusetts, New York, all that kind of stuff. But what's fascinating is it's not just there. So you've got, Colorado in there. So you've got the Southwest, you've got Montana in there, right? Then you've got some of these Midwest states: Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. And then you've even got a little bit of the South. You've got North Carolina, you've got Virginia, both of whom are changing. And so the breadth of the interest in climate mitigation is actually getting much larger. Now, the Deep South is not interested at this point, but you're getting this very, very broad set of actors. And in fact, I can quote a couple of stats about this. You're talking about, if you add all of these up and these, what you get is a country, actually, let me see if I can say this the right way. It represents 2/3 of the US GDP, 2/3 of the US population, and half of US emissions are represented by these entities. And in fact, if you were to take that as a country, it would be the second largest country in the entire world, next to the United States, in terms of economic activity. So it is actually a huge set of actors taking action on trying to do this. Okay, so then the next question is this going to take us anywhere? And we've looked at that, and so this is the third of the charts that show the line going down. It's always the same: emissions on the left, on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis. So we looked at 3 scenarios. One of them is with measures currently on the books, just stuff that's on the books, not even the pledges like California's pledges, just what's on the books. We would be getting to about 25% by 2030 reductions. So that's the US nationally determined contribution, but 5 years late. And then we looked at 2 other scenarios. One of them had to do with really expanding state level action, more consistent with a lot of these pledges we're seeing. And then we're talking about getting down towards something like 35 to 40%. And if we were to include federal re-engagement in the same time frame, taking the best policies of the states, we might even be able to get down towards 50%. Now that's very aggressive, and I'm not suggesting that any of this will or won't happen, but nonetheless, there's a lot of potential to move from the bottom up. And even with the actions today are moving us in a meaningful direction. And we've drawn the lines after that to the right that show the path to zero. And you can see that the current measures, the 25%, is not exactly on track, but it's still moving us there. And then if we were to do more action from the bottom, we could do even more. Let's see. If there's anything else I want to mention. A couple of things just to note about this is that key to a lot of this is just getting out of coal. For what it's worth, electricity is your top target. If we can stop using coal and electricity and then stop building new gas-fired power plants, we can make quite a bit of distance. So that's really important, but you also have to be doing everything, like I said, switching to electricity, conserving energy, all of those. And then I will also note that it's great that you can get to 37% just from using states, cities, and businesses, but that ain't going to get you to zero, because in the long run, although Texas, by the way, is a huge wind producer, but if Alabama and all those kind of places don't do anything, eventually you have to have federal policy. But at least over the next decade, you could make some distance just from the states and cities that are interested. So then just a couple more points, and then to finish off. One is then, well, a lot of people are asking, oh my gosh, we've had this pandemic. Is this going to make it easier or harder for us to do this? Is this actually now going to screw up everything? And we've looked at that, and in reality, actually, it looks like it's, in some sense, it might make it easier to address, to take action. And part of that is that the economic downturn has put a lot of pressure on coal. And once those coal-fired power plants retire, they ain't coming back. So it's retiring coal. And at the same time, because renewable power, particularly solar, is so cheap, batteries are moving forward, we're actually seeing not nearly as big a hit in the renewable sector as we are in coal and even in natural gas. And so that's really encouraging. People are also realizing they don't need to commute as much, potentially. And so that could be helpful. But I will also note at the same time, though, there are some bad things going on. For example, public transport is just getting creamed. And public transport is really important, but if you don't got riders, there's already so much pressure on support for public transport, and this is certainly making it much worse, not having nearly the revenue that we would have had before. But nonetheless, it's not clear that this is making it any worse. If anything, it might be making it a little bit easier. Now, that's not a good thing. Not that we all want to have COVID to solve climate. I mean, I've been in this business a long time, and we've always noted that if you just destroyed the economy, you could address climate mitigation. But that's maybe not everyone's favorite strategy for dealing with the climate. So then I think a couple more things. One other note is just the technology has been changing the game. It's fascinating. So if you went back 10 years, nobody expected, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but many people did not expect solar cells to be so cheap, batteries to be so cheap. And that's really changing the way to perceive this. At this point now, solar PV cells are cheaper than coal-fired power plants in many places, and cheaper than natural gas increasingly in many places. I was just doing at a meeting on this in China, and in China, PV is cheaper than coal in much of China, and at some point, maybe in 5-10 years, it'll be cheaper everywhere. So it's really changing the game, and that's really important because the governments respond to external pressures. They don't just decide, hey, we're going to reduce emissions and it's going to be super expensive. They say, wow, it's not that expensive, let's do it. It's similar to the way that we control ozone. The reason we were able to control ozone so effectively is because there were some cheap alternatives. And those alternatives are really now emerging. Electric cars are a real thing, and solar generation, wind generation, those are real things now, and they're really changing the game. You're getting these bids for solar power. I can't remember, there was one for Los Angeles. It was like 2 cents per kilowatt hour. It's just, let's just say it was cheap, really cheap. And you're just increasingly seeing that. Now, in the long run, there's all sorts of issues about how do you deal with a bunch of renewables on the grid, but let's not worry about that for now. That doesn't matter for the next 10 years. So I'm not convinced if this is your church or not. I took them off the map. Okay, I got it right. Good. Denise and Laurel and I were talking about this. I tried to get the right picture. So yeah, see, if I went back to the start, I started this cleverly by having a picture of the church parking lot here, and it was small. And now here at the end, it's big. And the point is, what can we do to be thinking about addressing these things? So I'll make a couple of final comments. So one is that I think there's a misperception of where we are in the US. I talked to colleagues around the world, and they thought, oh my gosh, you guys were so great, in the last administration on climate, you were doing all this, you were committed. Then you had this new administration and you're not doing anything anymore. In reality, that's not true. In the last administration, the administration was committed to climate, but for 6 years, the last 6 years, the Congress was not. And so the only way the US could take any action, despite what it was saying to the international community, was through regulatory actions, which you can only do so much. In the end, you have to pass laws. And so the US wasn't necessarily actually doing it. And it made this commitment for 2025 through the Paris Agreement. It was going to be pretty iffy making that. So, and then with the change in administration, yes, the federal government's not doing anything, but there's just been this enormous groundswell of activity. And I really think, to me, that's super important. It's important both for what's going on with climate, but also for how we think about what we can do. Because governments don't, they respond to what the people want. They respond to the way things are moving. And to the extent that we're starting to see solar power move in, we're starting to see electric cars, it's getting cheaper, governments will respond. And so the more action and the more momentum that we see, the more the government's going to respond. And I'll also point out that just from a personal perspective, and I'm speaking again not as an employee of anything but myself, the way a lot of politics works is through money. And as you see different industries having less money, every time you drive your car and you fill up that tank, you are contributing to lobbying for the oil industry, right? Every time you fire up your furnace, you are contributing to lobbying from that industry. And every time that you buy electricity from a solar producer, you're contributing to lobbying from that entity. So every dollar you spend has an influence on what goes on. And as you start, there's also sort of systemic effects. As you see the transition away from using gas in houses, it makes gas pipelines much more expensive. Then that makes things even harder. And so there's a lot of this sort of tipping point stuff that happens. And I think all of us, like in so much of what we can do, we can vote a lot with our wallets. And I just became, and I've been in this business for a while now. I've been doing it for 15 years, and I've been in the energy business for 25. And what I've seen is really that unless you're in Europe where everyone loves climate, and even there they don't, for what it's worth, but unless you're there, and that, I mean, that's a stereotype, but in general, unless you're in a place like that, the government just can't do all of this by itself. So what you have to look for is places where people are committed and can take action. And the more of that happens, the more it will just sort of build the momentum around this. And that's what we're seeing in the US. I mean, I think it's just moving and moving now in the US. So we'll see what happens. There's an election upcoming. I'm expressing no preferences because I still act like I'm at work. But I'll just say that if the election goes one way, there will be more federal engagement on climate. And a lot of that will be building on what's happened at the states. So that's all I have, but just a pitch to everybody to try and engage and realize that you can make a difference in the stuff that you do. Everyone's doing it now, and if we all do it together, we can actually do quite a bit. That is the end of my slides, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Wow. That was a great presentation, Leon. A great overview of the background and as well as a discussion of the current state. So we want to open up a question and answers in session, and I want to start with what's been put in the chat. Question 1. So we also are hoping there will be a new administration. If Biden is elected, do you think he'll rejoin the Paris Agreement?
Oh yeah, I think so. But that doesn't, so that just remember, I mean, that's my guess, and we can all guess, but yeah, I think so for sure, actually. I mean, I would be shocked if not. I mean, I don't think we've left yet. I think we're about to leave or something like that. I can't remember, but regardless, we will be in the Paris Agreement if Joe Biden is elected. But just remember, you know, agreeing to some international thing doesn't mean you're going to do anything, right? And so, you know, it's in some sense, it's a symbol. It's actually really important for what it's worth, because people, for what it's worth, people really do look to the US for leadership on climate. It's actually pretty interesting. They do. And that's one reason I think the Chinese announcement was in fact a statement of, well, who is the leader now? We're maybe a leader and you guys aren't. So I think people do look to it. So I think it's really important in that context. But you know, the issues of trying to get stuff done in the US are different than signing on. Let's just be clear about it. We're going to do we make our choice even under the Paris Agreement. We make our own choice. It's kind of funny. So leaving the Paris Agreement, what does that mean? If you're in the Paris Agreement, you decide what you could do anyway. There's no requirement. So anyways, but you know, so I'm sure we'll be back in, but that doesn't mean that we're going to do stuff. We were in it before, and I think it was going to be very hard.
All right. I was curious. I mean, we're already starting to see so many impacts in terms of forest fires, more hurricanes, melting glaciers. What is the temperature change we've already seen? And how optimistic are you that reaching the goals by 2050 is going to, I don't know, kind of save the world for grandchildren?
So I should know the number, which I don't remember, but maybe let's guess around a degree or something, or a little bit more. And a lot of it's baked in, right? So a lot of this is baked in. It's not going away, right? Because CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for so long. So we've already baked in much of that 1.5 degrees. And so, you know, I'll be honest, in my community, there's a lot of skepticism about this 1.5. When I was doing this 15 years ago, we looked at something that would be closer to what you would think about as 3, and we would say, wow, that's kind of ambitious. And then all the discussion turned internationally to 2, and we were like, wow, that's really ambitious. And now it's 1.5, and we're thinking, wow, that's really ambitious. So I'm not super optimistic about 1.5. And remember, there's a lot of uncertainty about that, but just to getting those levels, getting to 0 by 2050, I would say a couple of things though. One is that the recent trends in technology really are changing things. I don't think they're going to change it that much. I mean, not to 2050, but they are changing things. And that is really important and very encouraging. But I would suspect that we won't. And, but I do think that we will, increasingly see emissions coming down, just because this is kind of in the air at this point. And so I don't think we'll see the nasty scenarios I used to talk about, these baseline scenarios where the high end of the uncertainty range is 13 degrees or something like that. I don't think we're talking about those anymore, but I do think we're talking about a different world. That's just a fact. It's going to be a different world. And so, you guys back there are are feeling it through the forest fires and so forth. You said melting glaciers for sure. We'll see mosquito-borne illnesses move. And then, I'm now on the East Coast, and you look at the Southeast and the Gulf Coast, there's going to be a lot of issues with storm surge and inundation, what's going to happen to Florida. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to change, and that's baked in. It's going to happen. So I'm not super optimistic. I'm optimistic that things are going to not be the worst they could be. I'm not optimistic about getting to 1.5.
Oh, okay, thank you. So someone says, I already have an electric car and solar panels on the roof, so I'm supportive of those steps, but I've done a lot of reading that suggests there's serious problems with electric cars. For example, car batteries are relying on rare metals that are mined in exploitive ways and are difficult to dispose of safely. How can we work to mitigate problems associated with electric power so it can be more widely accepted? It's great solar panels are getting less expensive, but I've also read there's significant problems with recycling and or disposal of solar panels when they come to the end of the useful lives. What's the current story with manufacturing disposal of solar panels?
Well, no, I understand the question. I think it's a great question. I don't have all the answers to that. I do think some of the rare, maybe this comes from being somewhat of an economist, but I would say the rare materials in terms of the exploitative thing, I'm not sure what to say about that, because that's always, that's an issue that has nothing to do with the power itself. It just has to do with the way that different societies work. But in terms of there being resource constraints, I don't see. I'm skeptical of whether that's going to be a long-term issue. There's a lot of debate about that. And in fact, we're looking at it right now, and I'm not sure what my full answer is on it. But I'm not convinced that's going to be an enormous issue. The waste thing, I don't know. And honestly, I've wondered that myself. You're creating all these batteries and all these PV panels, and I don't know what the methods are going to be. So it could be that there's more recycling that happens, and that takes care of it. Or it could just be, they all end up in these giant dumps that are toxic. And I just don't have a good sense of it. But what I would say from my own perspective is that the issues associated with climate change are so pervasive that it's something that we probably don't want to, you do want to worry about it, but we want to move on climate change regardless and look for solutions to these other issues. That's my personal opinion. I feel like some of those will be solvable. Climate change, once it's baked in, it's baked in, and there's no going back. So anyways, I'm sorry, that's not a great answer. I'm only myself getting up on the literature on the issues of waste.
I'll just add on the electric cars. We have an Nissan Leaf, and the battery's definitely going, but I've seen that there's already secondary markets being started for using those used batteries for electricity storage.
Exactly.
And then
sorry, keep going.
For some of the cars, they're taking newer batteries from cars that have been in accidents and recycling those into the older cars so they have more mileage. And the other thing is, I think there's a lot of research going on, and I'm hopeful that battery technologies will start using less hazardous materials.
Exactly. So if you were to hang out with a lot of economists, I don't know if there's any economists on this, but economists always believe that the market will figure, not in a bad way, but also in a good way, that we figure out solutions. And so, I would maintain some optimism that these are problems that can be solved. That's what I would say. You can make the same comments about refrigerators and so forth. You see these giant dumps of them in places, and so any number of our material goods are a problem. And so I'm not sure this is constrained just to batteries and solar PV. It's just a problem with our society in general. And but I think I think there is a sense that a lot of these are potentially solvable, at least comparison to solving climate change.
Okay. That's all the questions are on chats. Does anyone have any questions in their mind that they've just been kind of interested in asking Leon? You can unmute yourself or wave or. Wow. We have an expert in Laurel. You want to unmute yourself?
Well, it looks like Fran and Jim Naylor.
Okay.
Yes, I'm rather disappointed that the environmentalists and individuals like you that are really interested in it have not been trying to more favorably introduce the latest technologies in nuclear power plants, which seems to me very likely to be the ultimate solution because of the incredible energy density of nuclear fuels, as opposed to the very dilute energies in solar installations. But nuclear has such a bad PR due to all the catastrophes in the past, which can now be avoided by much more advanced technology. And I'm just disappointed that this has not been pointed out as a real solution to our climate problem.
Yeah, I would say that it's actually has been, and it's a pretty big debate right now. But my own perspective on this is that the environmental community coming out of the 70s developed a pretty strong, what's the right word? I don't want to say hatred, but a strong tendency not to support nuclear power. And that's maybe not fully consistent with the needs to address climate change. And so there's a big debate in the environmental community. There's actually environmental NGOs that are focused on trying to get nuclear more in. But I will just point out that, I mean, nuclear has its own issues. The way, it's true that there's recycling, there's new cycles, there's what's called small modular reactors. But if you look at it, the issues surrounding nuclear kind of fall into a couple of categories. One of them I would call Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island, which I know you've articulated, or an issue, or Fukushima. And these are the issues of sort of local safety issues from meltdowns. So that remains a concern for folks. I know Fukushima was what's called an actively cooled reactor, which means it's not going to take care of itself. But I will just point out that, if it was hit by a tidal wave, but I will just point out that that's had an enormous effect. The Japanese are not doing nuclear. I mean, they're getting out of nuclear because of that. It was too big of a hit on them, and so they're not going to do it. And then another one would be, I'd say, sort of North Korea, which are these concerns about proliferation. Many of the more modern cycles associated with nuclear power produce weapons-grade materials or precursors to weapons-grade materials. And so there's all sorts of international security issues. Which countries do we want to be using nuclear power, and what does that mean? And then the final is what I call Yucca Mountain. So, we were going to store all our waste in Yucca Mountain. And I had a colleague probably a decade ago who was looking at large nuclear futures using reactors. And I remember he used to denominate the amount of waste that would come out of them in the number of Yucca Mountains. And not that there would be a ton, but the fact that we couldn't even get in one Yucca Mountain, tells you something about the political constraints. So I'm not at all disagreeing with you that it should be on the table. I do actually think it should be on the table, but I think we also have to acknowledge that there's both sort of cultural concerns about it, or, historical concerns, as well as some big issues. There are still concerns about danger, about waste, and about proliferation. So I wouldn't think that it's a silver bullet. And frankly, there is no silver bullet. This is one of the big lessons from our business, is there is no silver bullet. Some countries have a ton of hydropower. Go down to Brazil or Colombia. They're almost completely, off of hydropower. Some countries have enormous amounts of solar. I mean, in the Southwest, we can get enormous amounts of solar. So it just really depends. Every country is going to have its own solution depending on what its makeup is. But I do think, just for what it's worth, a lot of folks in the environmental community now, or there's parts of the environmental community that are saying, man, we should be keeping nuclear on the table. Why have we taken nuclear off the table? It's a real possibility. And it also provides, firm power, non-variable power, which has a lot of value as well. There's all sorts of advantages. So I think that it is more on the table, but boy, the environmental community it's so against nuclear power historically. So there's a lot to overcome there. Depends on the country, though.
We have another question. And Lisa, I see you, but we have one more ahead of you. Are there any countries showing as much subnational action as we are in the US? What about Australia, which seems to be clinging to coal?
Oh, that's a great question, and I wish I had a good answer for that. Wow, so I'm going out on a limb here. So I would suspect that we're kind of on the higher end because of our federal system, just the freedoms that we have in the US to do exactly what we want. You're not going to see this in China, for example, in the same way. Although, for what it's worth, in China, they have a lot more flexibility than you might imagine. I think, let me see, what could I say? You know, there's a number of international consortia that surround these basic ideas. So for example, there's the We Mean Business Coalition, which is a consortium of a wide range of different businesses that are devoted to these goals. And so that's international. And that kind of, I don't know if you'd call it subnational, but it's non-national actions taking place. There's also a lot of these now agglomerations of cities doing this as well, that are focused on these issues. There's something called C40, which is like 40 big cities, and they're all working together to try and do this, and that's international. But one thing I'd also point out is that you know, the U.S. and Europe maybe, and maybe you know, maybe places like Australia and Canada have the luxury to think about climate as an objective. But you know, you don't get that luxury everywhere in the world. So you know, in much of the developing world or emerging world, it's food security, it's energy security, it's energy access, it's air pollution, it's water and water quality. You know, those are the issues that are number one. I mean, in India, it's about getting energy access. It's not about, hey, can we address the climate? I mean, they're trying to, because they're actually a little bit susceptible. But you know, you're responding to a lot of short-term needs. So you know, places like the US and Europe kind of have a little bit more luxury to be making this a priority than much of the world, if that makes sense. So that's not a great answer to your question. I suspect we're kind of at the top because of where this, again, because of the change in administration and our structure and our sort of level of economic development provides us the luxury to focus on it at a subnational level rather than, you know, where am I going to get my food or, you know, that kind of stuff.
Great, thank you. And then Lisa, you had a question.
Yeah, this is just on a personal level. The two things we still need to do if we were going to go all electric would be, you know, we have a gas furnace and we don't have electric cars. But you know, it's going to be several years out before those things wear out. So in general, we've been thinking, well, we hold on to things until they wear out, and then look to replace those in the future, because just getting rid of good things, you know, increases.
Has its own issues.
Yeah. So is that a good strategy to take?
Oh, wow. That's a very personal choice. I would tell you that that's my strategy.
Okay.
So, but that's a decision based not on any real scientific basis. I can just say this though, that, you know, whether you were, you know, the key thing is that this kind of stuff happens, you know, over the next decade. I mean, it needs to happen quickly in that sense, but it doesn't need to happen tomorrow. But so I don't personally, just from looking at the statistics, waiting 2 years for something is not the end of the world, as long as that's the direction. A lot of this stuff is about capital stock turnover. When something's retired, will it be replaced? And a lot of the policies that people are considering are on new equipment. Because a lot, you know, it's very hard to get people to retire equipment early if they don't need to. The one place we want to do that is places like coal and so forth, coal power plants. But, you know, for furnaces, you know, right now emissions go into producing those things anyway, right? And waste is in itself not a good thing. So no, I don't think that's a problem, as long as when that time comes, you actually do the flip. I mean, I didn't do it last time. We bought the last time we bought a car, we bought a more efficient but still gas car, and I can tell you next time I won't. So when the next car goes, it'll be electric, and we'll be going all electric, but it'll be exactly the strategy that you're doing.
Okay.
But don't trust me. I mean, at this, I'm not an expert on the moral imperative on this. Other than if you do it within the next decade, we're going to be in, you know, that'll be helpful.
All right, thanks.
Okay, and another question was, natural gas isn't as bad as coal, but is it still too dangerous to include in the long-term solution? Yeah,
absolutely. So natural gas is better. Yeah, so for sure. So if you think about it, it's kind of staged. You got to get out of coal first, because it's just bad, and there's a lot of alternatives. And you can imagine oil may take a little bit longer because it's just very hard to find it's hard to substitute for oil in, let's say, planes or long haul freight or big boats. It's just hard. And even in light duty vehicles, as we go electric, it's going to take time. And so you expect oil to last a little bit longer. And it's true, yeah, gas is better. I mean, the general ratio is like coal is like, depending on the grade of coal, let's just say 25 units of CO2, and gas is like 15. So it's definitely better. But no, it's just inconsistent. You can't be using it. If we're trying to get down to zero, you can't be using it. It's as simple as that. And I will also note that the gas and oil industries are kind of the same industry in a way. They're not exactly, but they are very much overlapping. And so they're related too, from sort of a sort of industrial change level. So yeah, it can be thought of as a quote bridge fuel, but we've looked at this. If you start investing in natural gas power plants, you may have to retire them before their useful life is over. So it doesn't really make sense to be investing in natural gas at this point. Certainly not in the US. I mean, maybe in some places that are rapidly developing and they need to do something, but certainly not the US.
Okay, thank you. Anyone, I think we have time for one last question. If anyone has one, raise your hand. Or Jim and Fran, did you have a question?
Well, I was just concerned about reaching tipping points in climate change. These enormous fires that are sweeping through the Southwest in the US, in the West, and in Australia are going not only to remove all these carbon fixing trees and such, but also are going to drastically reduce the albedo as these blackened areas are exposed. And I'm just wondering how badly in the future, as more and more of these fires sweep these countries, this is really going to affect our rapid change in temperatures.
Yeah, I don't know enough about what replaces them, because that's fundamentally the issue. If they're replaced by more greenery, then that's different. If they're wastelands, then yeah, you would be changing the albedo, and you also would not have albedo. For those who don't, you guys know albedo, but it's just basically how much light is taken in or reflected back. So so how much energy in that, and so. But I think the tipping points that people are most concerned about are things like changing the thermohaline circulation, or what happens to the Greenland ice sheet, or those sorts of things. I've dealt a decent amount with the climate scientists, and those are the things that they worry about the most. A lot of it has to do with what's going on with oceans and what's going on with ice. As really big issues, but what you're talking about can only help but accelerate as we move towards that outcome. And I think a lot of these goals of 1.5 and 2 and so forth are built around the notion that maybe we can avoid some of these huge tipping points that would really just fundamentally change the way the world, the physical world works. So yeah, but I don't know. I can't answer too intelligently. I just think a lot of it depends on what comes in after there's a forest fire. And are we just going to be at a nuclear equilibrium where in essence we just have slightly less forest cover because there's so many fires? Or are we going to have some different type of cover that comes in that's less susceptible to fire and so forth? And I just don't know. But I bet the National Climate Assessment, which you could look at that if you guys are interested. I worked on that, but on a chapter that didn't look at this issue, and that would have information on forests. They'll have a whole section on forests, and you could look there. And that's the U.S. That's actually a pretty good piece of work for what it's worth.
Okay. I think we have one last question. Individuals get some tax breaks or rebates for going electric. What about industries? Do they get financial incentives, or do they also need to just wait until their current equipment needs to be replaced?
That's a really good question. I'm sure they'd get some. I can note a couple of things. Let's remember we do subsidize also in fossil industries, just to remember that. So there are incentives. But one of the big plays that's gone on, this is not maybe you're thinking about producing industries, but just broadly speaking, we've been subsidizing electric power from solar and wind for a while now through production tax credits and investment tax credits, renewable portfolio standards force it in. So there's a range of activities that are forcing those industries to take action. I don't know, and commercial buildings. So if you're thinking about commercial buildings and business that's in buildings, they have a lot of incentives for sure. There's a lot of incentives for construction and so forth. I don't know about heavy industry and manufacturing, what incentives are out there. I'm sure there's incentives for electric motors and so forth. I worked at PG&E for a while when I was much younger, and we had industrial programs that provided incentives for industrial facilities. I remember they were all across. I was up in Seattle going through Boeing facilities and working with them on rebates to improve their industrial processes and so forth. So I think those are out there. I'm pretty sure they're out there. And I bet if you went to the Department of Energy, there would be a large industrial program, industrial efficiency programs, and Energy Stars type programs that are associated with those industries. So I think it's relatively pervasive, and that stuff's important to get markets moving. I actually, before we go, I guess we probably don't have time, but I'm interested in what the climate action team at the fellowship is doing. Like, what are you guys actually up to? So I'm sure one part of it is chit-chatting and talking about strategy, which is what I do a lot with folks. But are there any, I mean, what are you guys thinking of and doing as you get together?
Yeah. We had some talks. Fran and Jim helped host a discussion on, and David Griffiths, who's not here, helped host a discussion specifically on nuclear power. So we talk about topics of interest. We had a workshop on solar installations, and at least one person here is actually installing solar panels.
Okay, that's fantastic.
Yeah, we had a workshop on EV vehicles, getting people acquainted with financial incentives on that.
That's great. That's fantastic.
You had also organized, but it was canceled because of the pandemic, the e-waste collection.
Right.
Great. So a lot of it's sort of like gathering to share information on strategies. Just like I was saying, the cities get together to share strategies. You guys are getting together to learn from one another and learn ideas and share strategies. That's super. That's really great for what it's worth.
Denise, one of the first things the team did when you were first starting last year was promoting the church members to have a competition and do an app called I Green Sunnyvale, where you got points for changing a lot of your habits. So that was a lot of people participated and have changed our habits.
That's great, because I it's funny, I came out of this, I came again up through sort of more of an economics discipline on this stuff, and that's all about, hey, let's have a national carbon price, and that'll take care of everything, and then it just doesn't happen, and but then you see what's happening today in the U.S. and you realize how much power there is from different groups. Faith-based groups are one of the groups we always list, working together to take action. If enough folks are doing that in places where there's common will, you can actually make change. So that's super exciting that you guys have that sharing. It's funny, I do so much of this, I don't really want to talk about it all the time, but I think that that's great. We should do more of that here as well with our friends about, or whatever groups we're in, about what things we can do. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention is Jim and Fran in particular worked on sharing plant-based recipes and hosting potlucks before the pandemic. So I think that was a real successful effort as well.
That's great. Yeah, this is really exciting. I'm encouraged.
Good.
We've shifted to a largely vegetable-based diet since we started this project.
That's important too, for what it's worth. Vegetarian diets are seen as an important way to address climate change. A lot of the world, as they get richer, wants more meat, unfortunately, in that sense. But it's actually something people do research on, and you can have a meaningful effect through moving to vegetarian diets.
Yeah. All right. Did you have any other questions for us, or anything you wanted to discuss?
No, this is super cool. This is really fun. If there's anything else I know about that I can help you with, I'm happy to do it. I may have exhausted everything I know in this talk.
That was a great presentation, and I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. And I want to again thank Bob and Rosalie for making this possible.
Right.
In multiple
I'll thank
ways.
him as well.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Leon. It's been
All right, nice to meet everybody. It's been a real pleasure. See you
All
guys.
right.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.